Everybody, I am Steve Levitsky. I am the director of David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Welcome to our Tuesday seminar, which is in hybrid webinar format today. Before I start, let me introduce my two co-hosts, Alicia Holland from the Government Department and on my right, and Francis Agopian from the Government Department to my left. Thanks as always to Darnell for her fantastic work in making sure that this happens. One announcement that for those of you on Zoom, there will be Spanish interpretation. Just go to the interpretation, click on the bottom of your screen and you can hear the talk in Spanish, but the three presentations will be in English. Okay, so the title today is The Future of U.S. Mexico Relations Under Trump 2.0. I think the importance of this topic doesn't need any explanation from me. All of us, I think, on both sides of the border need to very quickly come to a better understanding of how we got to this place, what the stakes are, and what the likely impossible future scenarios are. There's more uncertainty about U.S.-Mexican relations than I think at any time, and it's certainly in my adult lifetime. This is a discussion that is just beginning, that unfortunately I think will continue for at least the next 4 years, but is likely to be very intense. So in that context, we are really thrilled and honored to have three extraordinary panelists today. I'm going to introduce each of them in alphabetical order. They will then present in that way, or in that order. So first of all, we have Rafael Fernandez de Castro, who is the director of the prestigious Center for U.S. Mexican Studies at UC San Diego. He is one of, if not the leading scholar of U.S. Mexican relations of his generation. He has published several important books and a range of articles on U.S. Mexican, U.S. Latin American relations, and on Mexican foreign policy. He also served as foreign policy advisor to President Felipe Calderon. Welcome, Dr. Fernandez de Castro. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Steve.
Our second speaker is Dr. Santiago Levy. He's known to many of you, a PhD in economics, who has published widely on an unbelievable range of topics, including social policy, poverty alleviation, productivity and growth, education, tax policy, and trade and competitiveness policy. He's served in several high-profile public positions, including Vice President of the Inter-American Development Bank, General Director of Mexico's Social Security Institute, Deputy Minister in Mexico's Ministry of Finance, and President of Mexico's Federal Competition Commission. He is currently a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a senior fellow at the United Nations University, and a senior fellow at virtually countless other prestigious institutions. Welcome, Dr. Levy.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Steve.
Third, Viridiana Rios is a political scientist and journalist who writes for El País in Spain and Milenio in Mexico. Dr. Rios is one of ours. She is a PhD from the Harvard Government Department, where she wrote an extraordinary thesis on the causes of drug violence in Mexico. In fact, one of the first really rigorous analyses of that violence in the early part of the 21st century. She has published widely, both now in academic and journalistic circles, on violence, on poverty and inequality, on public policy in Mexico. She's author of the book No es normal, It's Not Normal, the rigged game that fuels Mexican inequality and how to change it. And she's generated quite a fan following in Mexico City. I'd like to take her out to lunch or coffee whenever I go to Mexico City. And these days, whenever we go out, our conversations get interrupted constantly by people telling her that they're big fans of hers. So welcome back, Viri. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
All right, we will begin with Rafael Fernandez de Castro.
Thank you, Steve. Well, I'm very happy to participate in this. I have very fond memories of Dr. Class. I was there for 6 months as a fellow, and those were some of the best months of my life and my family. So I wish I could be there. And I'm very happy to be here with Viri and Santiago, two colleagues and friends that I respect, that I admire. So here we are. Let me start, Steve, and all of you by saying that Mexico this time is not alone. I will say Trump 1.0 was too much on Mexico, and now I will say Trump 2.0 is floating the zone, and Mexico is not alone. Let me say two things about this. So I believe that, but not being alone, what I'm trying to say is that this is diluting a little bit the Trump's threats to Mexico. So two things about not being alone. First of all, Trump 2.0 has truly launched a crusade against liberal democracies. He's basically realigning the U.S. with its enemies. He's very close to Russia. He admires tyrants, and he behaves as a tyrant, no doubt about it. So on that, it's I mean, this is very new, and so Mexico is not alone because he's against Europe, he's against Canada, and so that is very important to set the framework about U.S.-Mexican relations. Second, I will say the only surprise of Trump 2.0 is that he has, as an American Caesar, he has territorial ambitions. That's something that we didn't know during the campaign. That's, to me, the only surprise of Trump 2.0. So he wants to have Canada as the 51st state. He wants to have Greenland, and he's about the devolution of the Panama Canal. He's all over the place. Okay, so again, to me, that this is diluting Mexico's problems with the U.S. because he's against everybody, and he's basically turning and he's, I would say, there's an implosion of Pax Americana. I believe that we're seeing an accelerated end of Pax Americana, this extraordinary period of 80 years in which there were peace in Europe. Of course, that finished with the invasion of Russia to Ukraine. So that's my first. So that is the world scenario. Second, I will say that Trump 2.0 threatened Mexico three ways. He said, first of all, that he will deport millions of Mexicans, that he will deport, he will make unprecedented deportations, and he will leave his mark doing that. Second, it was about unilateral military strikes because of fentanyl, and I will explain that. And third, that he will impose tariffs. Well, he has done tariffs, but let me go back. And I live very close to the border, so let me walk you why immigration has been so important. I will say that migration and the very weak migration policy by the Biden administration was the key to the White House. The single most, the largest amount of expenditure during his presidential campaign was on migration issues. He spent almost $1 billion, basically letting us know that the border has been open. And indeed, he was right. During the Biden administration, about 5 million people entered into the U.S. through Mexico. So there was almost no border there. Everybody was coming here and coming into the U.S. I just found out yesterday that in 2023, at the height of this crisis, Elon Musk paid a visit to the border. So, I mean, if I was very worried about everybody entering into the United States, just imagine how Elon Musk felt about it. Someone from South Africa that we should bear in mind, where is he coming from? Okay, so U.S. Mexico border during the last 5 years, the new dynamics is this is a border that was basically connected with the well-being of the world. If there were problems in Ukraine, they will show up in the U.S. Mexico border. For example, just 1 week after Russia invaded Ukraine, we started to have about 1,100, 1,200 in a daily basis Ukrainians landing into Tijuana to come across the U.S. Suddenly, in May 2023, we started to have hundreds of people from Turkey. What was happening? Elections in Turkey. Let me give you a figure that is very telling about what the Mexico border has been all about. In 2023, December 2023 was the highest ever month in which the Border Patrol made the largest number of apprehensions, 300,000. Out of those 300,000 in only a month, that was the peak of the crisis. Only 44% were from Mexico and from Central America. That is 56% came from every other country, from 99 different countries. Last year into the Tijuana airport, about 125 nationalities landed there. They didn't come to visit Tijuana. They came to come across the USA. So that is a very special new dynamic in the border. And now Trump is attacking Mexico, and he imposed yesterday tariffs to Mexico, saying that we haven't done enough about migration and enough about fentanyl. But last month, February, was the lowest ever in the last 25 years of migrants coming, of border patrolling countries with migrants. Nobody's coming because there's a lot of deterrence. There's a lot of fear. Trump has not been able to deport people back to Mexico, just few. They basically inducing fear. There's a lot of fear in the migrant communities everywhere in the U.S. And I will say all of those saying about that they taking them to the Guantanamo prison and those guys sent to Panama is basically about inducing fear. Let me say that I believe something, a big crack is coming up eventually. He has a dream team of deportation. Let's say that I will say one of his most trusted men, which is Mr. Stephen Miller. He has become very, very, very important in Trump 2.0 administration. He is the number 2 at the White House staff. He's basically the deputy chief of staff for domestic policy, and this is the brains behind all of this. He's very powerful nowadays because he's the one, he's from California, from LA. He's the one who has, since he was very young, all these archives showing all of these crimes committed by migrants without documents. But he was the one who brought into the Trump's orbit Elon Musk and Zuckerberg. During the last 4 years, when Trump was out of office, he was advising Trump how to spend his money, and his money to some social causes, and they have become very, very close. So this is someone that I believe it's very important there. And of course, you have this border czar and you have this homeland security. So the team is there. So something will happen eventually, because that, to me again, gave back the White House to Trump, the very open border between Mexico and the US. Second, military strikes. I'll be very brief on that. Yes, Mexican cartels has been named terrorist international organizations. That's very complicated because everyone doing business with these organizations could be subject to retaliation from the US Treasury, and so this could be very complicated for Mexico as a US partner. Tariffs. Why is Trump putting tariffs into Mexico? It doesn't make any economic sense. Santiago and Viri could talk to you more about that. But I will say it's something that is very much in Trump's heart and mind. He's a transactional politician, but since the mid-1980s, he was very much about tariffs. He's a protectionist in heart. He believes that the US was screwed up in the mid-80s because, for example, with Japan exporting so many cars to the US, and on the other hand, basically having all of these military bases there. So, he's a protectionist. He believes that the liberal world order was not beneficial from the US, and he's basically turning upside down this liberal world order. So how is Mexico dealing with Trump? I will say very, very well. I'm very surprised. I was in Japan last week, and I was basically invited there to talk about, how come Claudia Sheinbaum has been so good in dealing with Trump. I've been talking to a lot of Canadians, and they basically ask me, how are you doing to deal with Trump? So how come Mexico is dealing okay with Trump? So far, because of course he just imposed tariffs on us as of last night. I believe Claudia Sheinbaum has gravitas in dialoguing, in talking, in handling these very difficult leaders, these populist leaders. She basically, she was trained by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, so she knows how to deal with populists, and she's well trained. So far, she has shown this very cold head and very firm hand. Again, she has gravitas in dealing with Trump, and we can tell that. Second, I believe that we Mexicans, the entire history of, we never really thought about us Mexicans being strategic partners of the US. Yes, we became economic partners of the US. I have done my whole career telling my students, I mean, look at the US, they're very open, it's a very plural society. But in the end, Mexican nationalism has remained there, and Mexican nationalism is pure, I would say, prejudices and bias against Americans. We haven't really trust Americans, and that is showing now. So we never really bought the idea that the US was a lot of carrots and not sticks. We know that there were carrots and sticks, and now we know that there's only sticks. So I believe, yes, we Mexicans, we were somewhat prepared because of the history, because of the always rivalry with the US. And so I mean, it's for one or another reason, I mean, the sense of fear that you get in Japan against Trump 2.0, that you get in Canada, that you get in Europe, you don't feel it in Mexico that way. And I believe that Trump 2.0 is going to have lasting damage in the U.S.-Mexican relations. Yeah, there is, I mean, there is already, for example, there's less Mexicans now willing to come to study to the U.S. just in our terrain, because that happened in 2001 with the war against terrorism. We started to see a lot of Mexicans going to Europe or looking for different places to go. That happened again during Trump 2.0, and now it will happen in a harsher way. So let me stop here. I believe that again, this Trump 2.0 will have lasting damage. And again, Mexico is not alone. He's against a lot of people, and he's basically against the liberal world economic order that was imposed by the US. So again, I believe we're seeing the end of Pax Americana. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. You covered a tremendous amount of ground. Second speaker is Santiago Levy.
Okay, well, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you, Steve, for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to share the platform with Viridiana and with Rafael, good friends for many years. I think I'm going to center my remarks on trade and the economics of this. And I won't say anything about migration, nor will I say anything about drugs. It's not clear whether this shock is permanent or transitory. It is a very large shock. And if it's a permanent shock, in the sense that these tariffs are going to stay there for quite some time, it'll be a substantive shock with very large implications for Canada, for the United States, or for Mexico across the economic spectrum in terms of relocation of value chains. It's difficult to know whether this is a permanent shock or a transitory shock, because the motives that have been expressed by President Trump for these tariffs fluctuate between he doesn't like the trade deficit with Mexico and he doesn't like some automobile production in Mexico versus fentanyl. And these are two separate issues altogether, and it's not clear exactly what are the objectives. That said, this represents a large break in trust. And I agree with Rafael. It's going to be very difficult to weave back any trust in a relation between Mexico and the United States, because Mexicans rightly feel that this is basically a unilateral tearing up or dismantling, so to speak, of the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement that we had before. What are the implications of this for Mexico? Even before the shock, Mexico had a mediocre performance. If you look back at the period coming from 2000 to 2025, the last quarter century. And I go back that far because I want to highlight that this is not a transitory issue associated with a political party that is in power in Mexico, but it is a deeper issue associated with Mexico. If you go back for the last quarter of a century, the central issue about Mexico is that its economic performance, despite the free trade agreement with Canada and the United States, either in the form of NAFTA or in the form of the U.S. Mexico, whatever the name is now, has been mediocre. Mexico's economic performance has been very low per capita growth for a country that was expecting its integration into the North American free market zone to be something that would accelerate growth. Let me say that even under the best case scenario, in which these tariffs are transitory, and there's some sort of an agreement to renew the trade agreement under, the best case scenario is that the agreement is no worse for Mexico than it is today. And under that scenario, even before these tariffs, Mexico's economic performance was not good. Let me talk about 3 periods of economic performance. Look at the period from 2000 to 2018. You had governments from the PRI, you have governments from the PAN. There was no issue on the trade relation between Canada and the United States. Mexican exports were growing very fast. We are now export more manufacturers than the sum of Latin America together. And exports are almost 35, manufacturing exports, almost 35–40% of GDP. And despite that, per capita income growth in Mexico was about 1.3%. The fundamental reason that that's the case is because despite NAFTA, productivity in Mexico has not grown for the last quarter of a century. So, first period, 2000 to 2019, 2018, there's no uncertainty created by the United States. There's no uncertainty created by the government of President López Obrador, pre-PAN, standard world. And even in that context, which is the best that you could have thought of, with no uncertainty and all that, growth was extremely mediocre. Consider now the period from 2018 to 2024 before Trump. Growth slowed down even more. Some of it was COVID, but even if you correct for COVID, it's still the case that income per capita in Mexico grew less than in other countries of Latin America and grew less than in the preceding period. So our economic performance, which was already very mediocre, worsened in the last 6 years, even before Trump. Consider now 2025, before the tariffs were announced. Most projections for growth in Mexico had GDP growing anywhere between 0 and 1%. Probably the shock, particularly if it's longer lasting, will bring that rate close to 0. We might end up having a recession. It's very hard to tell at this point. There's too much uncertainty. But the critical point is that this is a quarter of a century of very bad performance, which now faces an additional obstacle in the face of the Trump trade shock. The Trump trade shock really, probably as Rafael was saying, the end of Pax Americana, will mark the end of a period of growth for Mexico, because what is now very, very clear is that even under the best trade circumstances, that was not enough to generate substantive growth in Mexico and prosperity. So now Mexico is in an even more difficult position because some of the few things that were propelling growth, the export sector, is no longer going to do it in the future, or if it does it, it's going to be a lot less than before. All talk about nearshoring and all that stuff that was going on around two years ago as a potential engine of faster growth for Mexico is now really very much, I think, a little bit pie in the sky. So where I want to go to is that things were not good before, even if we don't consider Mr. Trump. Of course, this has worsened it, but they were not good before. And this was not an issue of political parties. I want to really emphasize that. Mexico's mediocre economic performance has been there with PRI governments, with PAN governments, and with Morena governments. Mexico's problem is much deeper, and in fact, the underlying framework of growth in Mexico has been pretty much the same over the last 25 years. The bet has been on macro stability, on autonomous central bank, a flexible exchange rate, and integration into the world economy, and the bet has been that the expectation of the combination of that will deliver growth, and that combination of autonomous central bank, fiscal discipline, flexible exchange rate, integration of the world economy has been the same over the last 25 years, again, regardless of political parties. I'm saying that that combination is now clear, will not deliver growth to Mexico in the future. What these tariffs do is just highlight the need to really put on the table an effort, an intellectual effort, to rethink Mexico's growth strategy. More of the same will not do. Business as usual will probably not come back. And Mexico will have to make an effort to look into and ask questions as to why, even when things were going well in the international front, we did not grow. And what are we going to do now that things are not going well on the international front? What are we going to do now to grow? So I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully we have in the Q&A questions. But the point here is this marks the end of a period for the wrong reasons, but it obligates Mexico to really put aside a little bit all this discussion of this government versus this political party versus that political party, which I think at this point is secondary, and to focus on the more fundamental question, which is what is going to make the country develop and prosper in the next years ahead. Thank you.
Thanks. That was pretty depressing. Viri.
Sorry, yeah, here. Yeah, that's pretty depressing. So let me start by clarifying that Trump's trade war against Mexico, I don't think is really about controlling migration or fentanyl traffic. It is much more about showing, particularly to his base, that he can impose tariffs to Mexico and that he can humiliate U.S. trade partners. And what we are really experiencing is a display of power that is going to be very costly for Mexico, but it's also going to be very costly for American consumers. And the only winner here is Trump, personally, as a political figure. I'm saying this because if tariffs were truly a way to take, as Trump said, steps to alleviate the migration and drug crisis, then tariffs would have never been imposed today. I mean, not in this moment. And I'm saying this because in this moment, Mexico has rushed, well, since Trump took office, but particularly now, to implement a series of policies to precisely control migration and control crime. Mexico has changed very significantly its security policy, its migration policy, and also its economic policies. So as a result of these changes, what we are observing is that currently, today, the illegal crossings at the border are at its lowest point in 25 years. And crime is also being targeted with much more force than ever. So today I'd like to use the time that I have to talk precisely about how Mexico has changed or not during the few weeks that Trump has been in power. And I'm going to divide my conversation in three areas: migration, security, and the economy. So whenever I talk about this, I always like to start by saying that Mexico, we need to understand that Mexico is an obsession of Trump. The first foreign country that Trump mentioned in his inaugural address was Mexico. And it was also, along with China and Panama, the one that he mentioned the most. So according to Trump, Mexico sends criminals to the US, it protects drug traffickers, it facilitates undocumented immigration, it receives American money without providing any significant benefit to the US. In the mind of Trump, Mexico is also very powerful. It's economically beating the US. It's taking the jobs and the companies that used to operate in the US and take them to Mexico. Mexico, quote unquote, laughs at the US. And of course, it's an enemy of the US and a country full of rapists. So as you can imagine, when Trump was reelected, Mexico became and has been very afraid, particularly because of the economic consequences of his reelection. You have to remember that 80% of Mexican exports go to the US, 11 million Mexicans living in the US, and also remittances represents 5 points of the GDP of Mexico. So since Trump took office, the Mexican authorities have been rushing to implement policies to satisfy Trump. Let me start with migration. Since Trump took office, illegal border crossings have diminished 71%. And here I am comparing January to February of 2025, the last numbers. This is happening because Mexico has increased its detentions of migrants within Mexico. It has also changed the way they detain people. Now they are returning the migrants to the southern part of Mexico, to Chiapas, to Tabasco, to Veracruz. And this is very demoralizing because they have to start the trip again, like trying to get back to the northern part of Mexico. And Mexico has also stopped giving migrants a pass that allow them to be in Mexico, to transit through Mexico without being detained. Many of these policies, it's important to mention, many of these policies did not start with Trump. They come from Biden's administrations. Yet what we are observing is that there is much more effort to implement it. And also there is, as I think it was Rafael who was saying, there is a lot of fear among the migrant community. So that has also stopped them from trying to get to the border. Another thing that we are observing in terms of deportations is that so far deportations have not increased. This is not because Trump doesn't want to do it. I think eventually he's going to be doing it, but he's going to do it. But this is more because Trump's administration is so far still, I would say, logistically disorganized. Trump has tried to deport more people by imposing a quota of detainees. But there is a limit to what Trump can do because the process of deportation takes time. Remember that in the US, there are 70 migration courts that have about 3.5 million pending cases. So the system is operating over capacity. And the US is more focused right now on deporting people that has recently crossed or deporting people that has criminal cases, but it hasn't been capable so far of doing that in large scale. So the numbers of deportations, I would compare Biden with Trump administration, the numbers so far are the same. So what is new in terms of immigration? First, as I was saying before, Mexico is collaborating more. It has agreed on deploying troops on the border to control migration. It has also accepted the reestablishment of the Remain in Mexico program. So that means that migrants are going to stay in Mexico while they wait for the solution of their cases, of their asylum cases. And it is also helping Trump with deportations, particularly with those that go to Venezuela. Another thing that is new is that Trump has stopped accepting refugee or asylum cases, and it stopped giving the CBP-1 appointments. Now, in terms of security, Mexico has changed dramatically its security strategy. However, I think we have to be very careful not to only argue that this is a change that has happened because of Trump. I think this change has happened because of the arrival of Sheinbaum to the Mexican presidency. Sheinbaum was, as you know, very effective combating crime while she was the mayor of Mexico City. She appointed Mexico City's Minister of Security, Omar Garcia Harfuch, as the federal Minister of Security now. And Omar Garcia Harfuch, beloved police in Mexico City, he has changed the strategy, the security strategy of Mexico since he became the Minister of Security. So what we are observing is that Mexico, since September, is capturing many more corrupt politicians. It's also increasing drug seizures and arrests. It's also further enforcing the militarization of police forces. And it is also using much more a figure that exists in Mexican Constitution that is called prison without sentence. So basically capturing and arresting people and not waiting for trial, just like having them there in prison. This change again happened before Trump took power. This happened because Sheinbaum decided to change the security strategy. And the proof of this is that since December, we've been observing a very significant change on the numbers, for example, of seizures of illegal arms, the number of seizures of fentanyl pills, the number of arrests in Mexico, and also Mexico did the largest seizure of fentanyl on record. It was 1.1 tons of fentanyl. This all happened in September. This all happened, in December. So two things, however, that are new and that we are observing, I would say, because of Trump is, first, there is much more pressure to give results and to give results faster in terms of security. And the second one is extraditions. As you know, Mexico last week sent 29 kingpins to the U.S. These kingpins were already in prison in Mexico, but they hadn't been extradited. Sometimes for decades, because the extradition process is very long and is very convoluted. So now what the government of Sheinbaum did was basically bypass the process. And this is, I would say, a form of Trump contagion, because the Mexican government now feels that it can break the law in order to satisfy him, which is something that, constantly is happening currently in the US. Now, in terms of security, what are my concerns? My concerns are that the last time that we saw a similar strategy, that is a strategy that is so violent against drug cartels, the result was further more violence within Mexico. This is what I study in my own dissertation. So drug cartels fracture into smaller factions that battle each other. And there is a lot of noise here, I'm sorry. And also they diversify their portfolio of criminal activities. And, Mexico ended up being affected because there were more extortions and more kidnappings within Mexico. Mexican authorities, I have to say, they don't share my concern. They believe that this time is going to be different because they believe that this time they are not only targeting the kingpins, as Felipe Calderon did, but they are also targeting the sources of income. I personally I think they are being too optimistic. And I personally believe that maybe we're going to start observing an increase in violence in a few months. But if it doesn't happen, which is good news, then we would have to further conduct more research in order to understand what happened and what they did differently. Finally, in terms of the economy, there are two things that Mexican government is doing to satisfy Trump. The first one is that they are trying to substitute imports from China. The government has developed a specific program called Mexico Plan, where they are mentoring Mexican companies to substitute Chinese products. And they are also implementing tariffs to Chinese semiconductors. It's a 25% tariff. And they are thinking about extending these tariffs to many, many other products, and they are figuring legally how to do that. The second thing is they are thinking about the diversification. So Mexico is about to ratify a trade deal with Europe, and it is also talking to Latin America about improving commercial relationships. So there is an effort to diversify the portfolio of countries where Mexico exports. So to conclude, let me just say that I'm very concerned about how the Mexican government is reacting to Trump, because I feel that it is based on several assumptions that may not be necessarily true. The first one is that I feel that they think that they can satisfy Trump, which I'm not sure is true. Like, as we saw, tariffs just start today, even if they actually deliver on many of the migration and crime policies that Trump requested. The second one is that they think that if they satisfy Trump, he's going to respect the agreements. Again, this is not something I'm sure. And I think when we look at the case of Ukraine, Mexico should be fearful that that may happen too. And then finally, I feel that they also believe that if an agreement is reached with Trump, then Trump is not going to impose the tariffs. And again, I don't think that is true. And the proof is that here we are today with tariffs, with an open commercial war between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And this all happened despite Mexico deliver on the reduction of fentanyl traffic and also a very significant reduction on immigration. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Viri. So somewhat divergent views on how well the Mexican government is responding to this challenge. It should be some seats for debate. I open up the floor for questions.
Yeah, I would like to go back. I'm Rosa Gonzalez. I'm an astronomer, Mexican astronomer. I would like to go back to Santiago Levy's presentation about why Mexico hasn't grown or done better. So without rooting absolutely for any political party, there were attempts to have an educational reform. There were attempts to have the energy reform, and that was extremely short-lived. I don't know if that would have made any difference. It has never been possible to do anything about the informal economy sector that grows instead of being reduced, or to change the tax structure. So I don't know if that would help at some point, or that's also old thinking and we have to be even more imaginative and more creative than that. Thank you.
Go ahead and answer.
Do you want us to answer
Yes,
one by one, or you?
Yes,
decide
go
this?
on.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rosa, for your question. It's the $64,000 question. So let me answer it in two parts. The first part, I think, is not really subject to much dispute. I think pretty much every economist would agree with this. The basic reason why we have grown so slowly is because productivity in Mexico has not grown for the last 3 decades. That's almost an accounting exercise. And compared to the United States, compared to Canada, compared to other countries in the world, productivity is an important component of growth, and that in Mexico has been zero, literally zero, for the last 3 decades. So that's the first part. The second part is why? Why is it that productivity is not growing if we have free trade and we're exporting all these things? That's the more difficult question. My personal view is that this is not an issue associated with education. This is not an issue associated with energy. And I think that the reforms that were propelled by President Peña Nieto were not focused on the central issues in Mexico. We're not. I think the central issue is to try to understand why 60% of the labor force works informally and 90% of firms in Mexico work informally. When we talk about Mexico, most of the time we're talking about the export sector, manufacturing, the automobiles, this and that. That is just a part of Mexico. And that's not the biggest part of Mexico in terms of employment or in terms of the number of firms. And a constant in Mexico over the last quarter century, even before that, but just talking about from 2000 onwards, has been that informality, both of labor and of firms, have persisted. And this explains why productivity has not grown. You can then ask the question, why is it that Mexico's informal sector continues to be so large? And here the answer gets even more complex, and I won't go into because I don't want to take all the time, but it does have to do with taxation, of which no government in the last quarter century has been willing to do anything. It does have to do with the structure of social insurance. It does have to do with macroeconomic issues about contract enforcement, of which no government in Mexico over the last 25 years has been willing to do much. So this is not an issue of PRI, of PAN, of Morena. This is a deeper issue about having a proper diagnosis of why is it that productivity hasn't grown. And I think now this becomes urgent to have a discussion about this, because I think to try to look forward and say, well, we will diversify trade with Latin America, we will diversify trade with China, that's all fine. I'm not against it. That's fine. We should do that, and that's fine. But there's no reason to think that that will make things different from what they were before, and that's going to change productivity. I don't know if that helps a little bit.
You want to jump in, Viri?
Yes, can I add something? On this, Santiago and I, that we have been discussing this many times, but it would be nice to do it here too. On this, we have a different view, because, and I do think we should open the possibility of thinking about informality on a different way. Informality may not be necessarily the problem. It may be just a symptom of an economy that is not working, right? So once we start understanding informality as a symptom, not as something that we should battle, like it's not about that. Like informality can be, you know, fixed very simple if you just destroy IMSS and create a general access to public insurance. The real problem is that we have informality because the Mexican economy is not working on three main areas. The first and most important, in my opinion, and according to my own research, is that we have a problem of monopoly economy, where a lot of firms have market power, and the only firms that have become productive have been precisely because they have access to some form of market power in some area. I'm talking about telecommunications, radio, media, so on. You know, there is a very large set of industries where we have that problem. The second one is that we have a taxation model that is regressive and that does not touch the rich enough. So we have fiscal problems. We have never been capable of properly creating a system that gives education, health, and basic benefits to the people. And then finally, we have a country with very poor labor regulation. And that's why whenever the economy grows, and the very few moments in which we have observed increases in actual growth, that growth has been captured by a very limited number of families, most of them in Mexico City and Nuevo León, and it has never trickled down to the rest of society. So what we are observing in Mexico is a political problem. It is a problem of PAN, PRI, and Morena, because none of these parties, nobody has dared to create a proper antitrust regulation to change the way the people pay taxes, and also to change the labor regulation. AMLO did a little bit in terms of the minimum wage and outsourcing, but it's not enough. So I am hopeful, and hopefully this is my best case scenario, that Trump may finally open the possibility and the door for Mexico to start really discussing these things, right? Because for many years we had the bilateral relationship as an escape for the economy, as a way to make Mexico grow, even slightly, but we had that. And now, if that door is really closed, then now for the first time, Mexico is going to have to be serious about discussing the problems that are inhibiting the country from properly delivering to its people.
Let me jump in here just a sec.
All right, then I'm going to get another question.
I fully agree that this is, informality is the manifestation of a problem, it's not the problem. So we shouldn't get caught in semantics. It's a manifestation of the problem. And yes, taxation is a big issue, and certainly is a big issue. Monopoly is a big issue. And what is important here is, unless the issues that cause informality, it's the manifestation of the problem. Unless the issues that cause it are tackled, we're going to be continuing. And yes, monopoly power is part of the problem too. And we should have a stronger antitrust authority. Unfortunately, we don't have. So I think what we need to highlight is that looking forward is the internal domestic issues that we need to really tackle and stop thinking that looking abroad to international trade will solve it. We can do it, but it's not enough.
Carla.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have a very, very specific question. I wonder whether you have any thoughts about the case that the Mexican government filed first at the Massachusetts instance, the federal court, that was declined. Then Mexico, I think, appealed at the First Circuit. And today, I think the arguments were scheduled for the Supreme Court, which is quite an outstanding feat. And I was wondering about this case for two reasons. First, because Sheinbaum said that given that Trump expanded the terrorism category to certain groups in Mexico, that she would expand the lawsuit so that the gun companies would be complicit of terrorism. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, because of the legislation that is at stake, which I can't remember the name, but it's something like the protection of laws, armed commerce or something like that, which is usually taken as a benchmark when the export of violence from the US to Mexico has increased dramatically. And this is the basis of the case. So I was wondering whether there is any thoughts about that.
If I might say something, I believe it was a very smart idea of the AMLO administration of Marcelo Ebrard, when Marcelo Ebrard was the Mexican foreign minister, to suit the arm industry in the US. That caused lasting damage in Mexico. Since the ban of assault weapons expired in the early 2000s, we can tell that the fire of the Mexican cartel has increased tremendously. And so I believe we're using, I mean, that's the best way to do, I would say, diplomacy in Mexico, or Mexican diplomacy in the US, is to use the US resources, domestic resources, go to courts. And we did it in an impeccable way. I'm glad that the case is coming to the Supreme Court. Well done for Mexico. I don't think this is going to really solve things in Mexico. The US has an enormous problems of arms, but at least we're basically making a very good point that we need the US to help us in that, because yes, there's a lot of arms coming into Mexico. Let me tell you, I'm talking about fentanyl and all of this. I believe that Mexico comes, and Claudia Sheinbaum comes, in a very shaky ground on fentanyl. López Obrador, for 5 years, kept on saying, we Mexicans, we don't produce fentanyl. That annoyed not only Republicans, but the Democrats. Very good friends of Mexico say, I hate your president, because you all know that the opioid crisis is causing lots of damage in the US. It's awful what is happening. So I believe that we're in very shaky ground, because Claudia Sheinbaum, she cannot openly criticize López Obrador. She's completely, I agree with Betty. I mean, there's a lot of bullets, not hawks anymore. But still, I believe that we come in very late to the game. And it will be very difficult to stop fentanyl, because we know that the mullahs, the people crossing with fentanyl, is basically US students. It's everybody else, but they don't need containers. It's not like marijuana. It's very low doses, will cause a lot of harm. So it won't be easy. And I believe that finally we Mexicans are getting the importance of helping the US to stop this. Unfortunately, now we're pointing the finger at each other. This is like in the 1990s. We've seen this in the past with the crisis of crack cocaine in Washington, D.C. and in the US in the 1980s. We did the same. And then we get the worst out of the US and they get the worst out of Mexico. It's really a huge problem of public health in the US. Mexico could help, but until, I mean, Sometimes, and we must say that there's a lot of fragmentations, for example, of the Sinaloa cartel now. It's truly fragmented because the U.S. intervened, got into the U.S. Mayo Zambada, and there's a big mess, and there's a war in Sinaloa because of that. So it's that is complicated. I believe that out of the three threats of Trump, I'm very worried about a military unilateral attack to Mexico. It could happen. I believe that people the team of Trump is ready to do that. And that would truly, I believe that the tariffs today that are going to cause lasting damage won't be easy to implement. But if they will come with a military strike, that would really make a big difference in the relationship. So I'm very worried about that because, again, we're in a very shaky ground.
Alicia.
Okay, great. I want to pick up on fentanyl, and then I have two other questions. Viri, I really wanted to ask you, I know the goal is not effectively combating fentanyl, but I did want to talk about what is different potentially in this drug market versus cocaine and heroin of the past. Are there any strategies that you think the government could be using in terms of attacking supply chains that maybe would look different than what we had seen when we were thinking about cartels and cocaine? Second, Santiago, I wanted to talk more about the labor market effects in Mexico. If we're seeing deportations as well as the closure of the chances to migrate to the US, what do you expect in terms of numbers, unemployment, informality? And also, while I share the dream of creating a new growth model, it's probably not going to happen immediately. So are there any policies to absorb those who are being deported, or to think about, encouraging entrepreneurship or something among those who are now seeing their chances of migrating thwarted that could be effective in the short term from the Sheinbaum government? And then Rafael, I wanted to ask you, you began, rightly making the point Mexico is not alone. Is there a role for Sheinbaum to play a larger role in leading an international response to Trump? What sort of alliance structure could you see forming among Latin American governments or among an alliance against Trump more globally? And do you think Sheinbaum also has it in her to lead that sort of initiative?
Okay, so let me just start. So I would say two things are different, Alicia. The first one is that Sheinbaum is battling a crime that is already more diversified and more fractured, and this is a trend that starts with Felipe Calderón. So now what she is really battling, I would say, are not really drug cartels anymore. I would question whether Mexico has drug cartels anymore. I think what we have is criminal organizations that are much more broad on what they do, that control some areas, some specific areas of the Mexican territory, but that are not necessarily only doing fentanyl. I could observe, therefore, a possibility in which criminal organizations decide to stop doing fentanyl just because, it's a lot of trouble with the US and with Trump. And then they remain being criminal in other activities, right? So some of them do not even get most of their money from fentanyl. They are getting most of their money from extortion of local businesses, from monopolization of specific industries. For example, sometimes they force people to buy them cement, right? And they say, we're gonna be here, the only business in town of cement, and you have to buy to us on 30% more expensive, right? So they are doing those forms of monopolization of markets within Mexico now. So it is a much more difficult, I would say, a task to go after these organizations. The second one, and this is kind of like on the good side, is that now we have a very unified government in terms of Morena is not only controlling the federal level of government, they are also controlling 20, if I remember correctly, I think it's 26 states, but we have to fact check that, 26 states of Mexico out of 32. And they also control a very large number of the most important municipalities in the country. So that creates, kind of like a very interesting equilibrium in which they are capable of enforcing the law in different levels of government. And that's precisely what we have been observing with Omar Garcia Harfush, the police that I was previously referring to. What he's doing is organizing at the federal level with the intelligence gathered at the federal level, and then implementing most of his actions at the municipal level. So he has even been capable of capturing some particularly corrupt authorities at the municipal level. So here we have kind of like two things that go, kind of like on different direction. On one side, a crime that is much more diversified and powerful and capable of moving faster and operating in different areas. But at the same time, I state that for the first time since Mexico democratization has the capacity to enforce at the 3 levels of government.
Thank you for the question on the labor market part. But quite clearly, the labor market was decelerating before the shock now, because growth has been slowing down and it was forecast to be less than 1% for 2025. But if these tariffs become permanent, and if there's a lot of uncertainty, this will certainly depress trade, depress investments, and the natural reaction in the labor market will be a mix of 3 things. You will see a slight increase in the open unemployment rate, but that's not really the main adjustment mechanism in Mexico. Open unemployment is low. It'll increase somewhat. You will see a slight increase in informal employment, and probably you will also see less participation. Some people working, instead of working 20 hours a day, working 15 hours a day. So even though they're employed, you might want to call them underemployment, whatever word you want to use, participation in the labor market is going to go down. So it's not a pretty picture. What can the government do? In the very short run, the government has a very difficult job because they're going to have to work on 2 parallel planes. They have to worry a little bit about the fiscal accounts and about the macro situation. And that's not strong because public debt has been increasing and because there are no margins very much on the fiscal budget. You don't want to increase your debt a lot in a context in which there's so much uncertainty and in a context in which eventually financial markets could begin to show some uncertainty as well. I think the peso is depreciating a little bit. I think that is good. Perhaps some further depreciation of the peso would be welcome in an orderly way, as a way of partly absorbing some of the shock. That said, I think the government will have to do something on the fiscal side. And what I would do is I would think about doing more taxation, particularly in the upper deciles of the income distribution. But I will also think about using the tax system to promote formal employment. You can think of negative income taxes, you can think of subsidies to employment, you can think of lowering the cost of social security contributions, you can think of many ways of doing it. I would not go in the route of promoting entrepreneurship. I would not do that. Mexico has way too many firms already, and many of these firms are unproductive. What you need to do is to create productive firms and productive jobs, not just any firm and any job. If you look at the rates of job creation, and they're already very high in Mexico, the problem is that there's also a lot of job destruction, and mostly because the firms that are creating these jobs are very fragile, small firms. What you need to do is to promote medium-sized, formal firms that can create jobs that are more stable and have better prospects. So I would not go the route of the microcredit. I would not go the route of the promoting entrepreneurship. I would go the route of trying to begin to tackle some of the underlying issues that keep formal employment. I would focus a lot on mid-sized firms and small firms in Mexico. That's where most of the jobs are. And I would try to use taxation as a first step, not the only one, as a first step in trying to ease. You mentioned that it will take a while to get a new growth model. Yes, And precisely because of that, we should begin to do it. Doesn't mean that we do everything at once, but it just means that the short-run response has to think about the fact that you want to begin to also traject in the medium-term response to the crisis. And that is where I think the government needs to think and concentrate the efforts.
Could you? I didn't catch the name of the one who made the question about Claudia Sheinbaum just leading some group of countries. What is your name?
Alicia Howell.
Hi, Alicia, because I think this is a very good idea. I want to float the idea.
Call it the Holland Plan.
I want to float the idea to Mexican Foreign Minister De La Fuente, and I don't want to assume that this is my idea. So that's why I made your name. Now let me tell you something. Let me tell you a few things here. I believe that Trump respects Claudia in a way, as he respected AMLO, because the guy is about power. And he knows that AMLO and now Claudia, they're very powerful. So then this is something important in his taking of Mexico. Second, I believe it wouldn't be that difficult for Claudia to do this. I don't think she's interested because she continues to be much more domestic oriented. That is her ideology. I mean, it's Cuarta Transformación, it's the fourth transformation. But above all, I don't think she could do it because then she really cross swords with Trump. Trump hates coalitions, hates multilateralism. So if she would try to lead some countries against Trump, that would really make to cross swords. I believe that she could resort to that. I mean, it will be just the measure of last resort. But otherwise, it would really backfire to Mexico because you don't want to cross swords with him. This is a guy. If you haven't seen The Apprentice, you gotta go and see it, the film, because then you understand. I mean, the style that he has. He is someone that whoever cross swords with him, he will come back in very big ways. So you don't want to mess with him. And also, I believe that Latin America, unfortunately, is very fragmented. The leadership that could be coming from Brazil, I mean, Lula in his third term is not the same that he was. And we're very divided. And I'm very sorry to see this Latin America so divided, so fragmented. Santiago is someone who has thought a lot in Latin America as a region from Washington. And I haven't seen, I mean, this Latin America with this very, I mean, we don't have a voice in world affairs because we're so fragmented, and I don't think that Claudia could do anything about it. Let me just say something about what Viri was talking about. I believe that yes, Omar Garcia Harfuch and Claudia, they basically changing the abrazos, the hugs, and no bullets. But I believe that they should be careful because, I mean, AMLO was right in the sense that we have to have hugs and balazos. We have to have hugs and guns because, yes, violence is multidimensional. There's a lot of I would say social injustice in Mexico that I mean, the fourth transformation has been very good in trying to target that. They shouldn't forget about that. And so let me lastly. Mexico believes, and this was very much in AMLO's head. He believed that good Mexicans, we don't consume drugs. This is for Americans. Unfortunately, there's a crisis of fentanyl in Baja California and in Mexico City. A team of doctors in UC San Diego, they've been seeing that, for example, surely in Mexico City and in Baja California, there's a lot of Mexican young males, mostly young males, dying of heart attacks. They're not heart attacks, it's fentanyl. What happened is that they don't have the substance to check the bodies. And so we don't know, but there's a lot of fentanyl consumption in Mexico. So we must do something to stop that. So so that's why I'm as Viri, I'm a little worried about now going back to the war on drugs, because we know we have failed on that. And I hope that Claudia will continue to exercise a lot of sound social policy, because Mexico badly needs it, and that should be go hand in hand with I would say a strategy of combating the cartels.
June.
Yeah, thank you. Two questions. One is, with this atmosphere of fear that Rafael is describing, plus actual deportations, what's been the effect on remittances? And the second question is, I lived in Colombia when it had import substitution, and that, it boosted up the prices of goods that were coming in from outside and created a tremendous wave of contraband. So I'm wondering if there has been any thought in Mexico about what these tariffs may do in giving the criminal organizations a field day with contraband of absolutely normal products, and if there have been any preventative steps.
I wonder if Santiago has the latest number of remittances, but I believe that in the last 2 months they have continued to grow, June, and I'm very worried about that. But very good to see you, June. I'm very worried about J.D. Vance as a senator from Ohio in his very short tenure. He entertained a bill about taxing remittances, and so I believe that some way they're coming back to that, and that's going to be very detrimental of remittances, because it's yes, for Mexico it's 5%, but for El Salvador it's 23% of GDP, and this is huge money for Latin America, or for the Latin America that has a diaspora in the U.S. So I'm very worried about that. They're very busy, but I believe that's coming. I'm very worried about it.
Okay, let me ask
and you're right. There's going to be contrabando. There's going to be. A friend of mine who works here, who has one of the most important custom businesses in San Diego, he's telling me it's going to be impossible to implement these 25 tariffs. So there's going to be problems in the border. There's going to be chaos, and there's going to be a lot of smuggling. And yes, that might be a very good business, because now let's face it. The cartels, they have. They are doing all sorts of businesses. They diversifying. They truly diversifying, and this will offer them a beautiful opportunity to better diversify. Sorry, Steve.
No problem. I guess this is for anybody who, any three of you who want to answer. We've only got about 5 minutes left, but I wanted to ask a little more about the relationship between the government and the business community in Mexico. The last government was fairly populist and had a relationship of relatively high level of distrust from the business community. Sheinbaum is an old lefty, doesn't trust capitalists. They didn't trust her when she came to office. But this situation is clearly throwing them together. The government needs the private sector. The private sector is going to need the government. And so if you could comment either sort of on what is happening in terms of dialogue between the government and the business community, and what should be happening in terms of dialogue between the government and the business community, that would be great. And for Vidi, does this sort of mutual need between the two sides make it more or less likely that we would see the kind of anti-monopoly policies you were talking about? Why don't we go in the order of presentation? We'll start with with Rafael.
Okay, Steve. I've been in Mexico a lot, touring Mexico, talking about Trump 2.0, talking to a lot of business persons, and the word I received from all of them is that Claudia Sheinbaum is much more willing to talk to them. that they basically engage in conversation. That is very different from AMLO. Not to say that they following them, but at least they engage in conversation. They seen a very different energy policy coming, and so I will say there's an opening. And I believe that the way Claudia so far has been dealing with Trump has provided her with huge legitimacy, and she had it already, and this had really gave her a boost. So in that sense, Trump has been fairly good for Claudia, because I believe now there's less doubt in Mexico that she's in power. And I am seeing few numbers the last 2 days, and apparently Mexicans believe that she's calling the shots, not AMLO, as a lot of critics used to say. So this is, for domestic policy, I will say Trump 2.0 has been beneficial for Claudia.
Santiago.
I think it's good that the business community and the government talk all the time. And I think it's good that they forge, links. I do think that this crisis certainly is going to bring them closer, because they both face a very unwelcome situation, and the incentives are for them to work together. So the fact that President Sheinbaum is more willing to dialogue than President López Obrador, I think is good. I think she should show more pragmatism in a context in which things are so difficult. That said, I come back to a point I made in my intervention. We should not confuse the business community in Mexico with Mexican entrepreneurs. The vast majority of Mexican entrepreneurs are not represented in the organismos cúpula, which is the expression they use in Mexico, the Consejo Mexicano de Negocios and the Consejo Coordinador Empresarial. They are not represented there. So there's a risk that if the dialogue is only between the government and those organizations, the substantive needs of middle-sized firms and small firms are not going to be taken into account as part of the response. So the government needs to, of course, dialogue with the, so to speak, organized business community and forge alliances, and that's welcome. But the government also has to consider that that's not all of the economy, and the response has to incorporate the firms that are actually responsible for creating most of the jobs. Manufacturing in Mexico only creates about 1 out of every 5 jobs. The rest of the jobs are not in manufacturing, which is what's going to be most affected by the Trump tariffs. And the last point on monopoly, as you mentioned, I was the first head of the Mexican Monopoly Commission in Mexico. I think there's a substantive task that needs to be done. I agree with Viridiana that there's some areas in which clearly monopoly power is being exercised to the detriment of Mexican consumers. I'm not optimistic. I think that the fact that the Competition Commission is being redesigned as part of the constitutional reforms will weaken it. I hope I'm wrong. I think it will weaken it. And I think the government will be less keen on taking on the large monopolistic sectors of the economy in this very particular context. So unfortunately, something that had to be done over the last quarter of a century, I think that agenda of strong anti-monopoly is weakened. I'm not sure it's going to be very much action in the next few years. I hope I'm wrong on that front.
Viri, you have the...
Yeah, thank you. I would say there are, in terms of whether Mexico is going to be capable of battling the monopoly problem that it has, I would say there are 2 forces that are pushing again in different directions. So the first one is that indeed, Sheinbaum has a much better relationship with business, not only because of Trump helps, but not only because of that, it's also that she in general is a little bit less confrontational than AMLO. She's more opening to listen. She also changed the leader of the Minister of the Economy, and now that minister is run by Marcelo Ebrard, who is very pro-business and is also very trusted by the business community, right? And that has kind of like positive things for Sheinbaum because that creates, further more support for her government. But it also has a negative effect that indeed real business are not represented in these organizations, is the Mexican oligarchs who are represented, right? So then that's a problem because if you have Mexican oligarchs designing the industrial policy of Mexico, this is something that I've been writing a lot about. If they are designing the industrial policy of Mexico, it's not going to work because they have no incentives to create competition for themselves. They only want to capture like a larger part of the market for themselves. The second force, which may be positive in terms of battling monopoly, is Trump, because, so one good thing is that he may pressure the Mexican government to open some of the industries that are currently monopolized by Mexican business. For example, telecommunications is protected at the USMCA, not entirely protected, but sufficiently protected, right? So if he were to push Mexico in the next negotiation of the USMCA to further open telecommunications for American companies, then probably we would observe a diminish in market power in that specific industry. And that could happen in other industries too. So, it's very difficult to tell what would happen. But again, this hasn't happened in like 30, 40 years. So I don't know if it's going to happen now, but I'm hopeful.
Okay, I need to close two quick announcements before I thank our panelists. First of all, next week's Tuesday seminar is Professor Lindsay Meka, whose talk is Urban Securitization in the Name of Human Rights. That's next Tuesday. And I also want to invite you to attend the annual Mexico conference. The title of that is Distant Neighbors or Regional Partners Reflecting on U.S. Mexico Relations under Two New Administrations, basically carrying on the themes we were discussing today. That's March 27th and 28th. To register for that conference, go to the Dr. Class website. That said, many, many thanks for an outstanding conversation. Thank you, Rafael, Fernandez de Castro, Santiago Levy, Viri, Rios, Contreras. Thanks so much. We hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Good to see you.